20 experts sat around the table, and not one of them had an answer. These weren't random consultants. They were the best of the best. Engineers flown in from 3 countries. Analysts who charged 6 figures per hour. People whose names carried weight in boardrooms. For hours, they argued, recalculated, and stared at the same screen. Every solution failed, every theory collapsed. And with every passing minute, the billionaire CEO at the head of the table grew more impatient. The problem was simple to describe, but impossible to fix. A system that powered a billion-dollar operation kept breaking at the worst possible moment. Every crash meant massive losses. Deadlines were slipping. Investors were asking questions. Reputation was on the line. 20 experts had tried. 20 experts had failed. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was tired. That's when Ozzy Osbourne spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just calmly. He hadn't been invited as an expert. He wasn't there to impress anyone. In fact, most people in the room had barely noticed him. He'd been sitting quietly off to the side, watching. No laptop. No notes, no interruptions. While everyone else was talking, Ozzy was listening. The CEO rubbed his temples and muttered, "So you're telling me no one here can solve this?" Silence. Then Ozzy glanced at the screen. "Can I say something?" he asked. A few heads turned. Someone raised an eyebrow. Another expert smirked, clearly annoyed. The tension in the room was thick. This was not the moment for random opinions. "You have 60 seconds, the CEO said flatly. Ozzy stood up. He didn't walk to the whiteboard. He didn't ask for data. He didn't ask questions. He simply looked at the problem and smiled. "Everyone here is overthinking it," he said. A couple of experts shifted in their seats. One quietly scoffed. 60 seconds had barely started ticking, and already this felt like a waste of time. But then Ozzy pointed at one detail on the screen, something everyone else had ignored. "That," he said, "is why it keeps failing." The room went completely silent. The CEO's eyes widened, because in that single moment something became very clear. After hours of failure, after 20 experts came up empty, Ozzy Osbourne had just seen the solution in less than a minute. And what happened next stunned everyone in that room. The meeting hadn't started calmly. It never did. The private boardroom sat on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the city. One of those places where decisions worth millions were made before lunch floor. To ceiling windows. A polished black table, screens lining the walls, and an atmosphere thick with pressure. This wasn't a brainstorming session. This was a crisis. At the head of the table sat the CEO. A self-made billionaire known for 2 things: building massive companies and having 0 patience for failure. His phone buzzed every few minutes with updates he didn't want to hear. Numbers were bleeding, systems were stalling. Every delay cost more than most people earned in a year. That's why the experts were here, 20 of them, each one carefully selected. Each one introduced with impressive titles and even more impressive resumes. Some had written books. Others had built systems used by governments and global corporations. They arrived confident, laptops open, ready to dominate the problem. At first, the room was loud. Everyone talked, everyone explained, everyone disagreed. Graphs appeared on the screens. Code scrolled endlessly. Whiteboards filled with arrows, formulas, and assumptions. Every expert believed they were one insight away from the solution. But as the hours passed, confidence turned into frustration. Solutions worked, then failed. Fixes created new problems. Simple explanations fell apart under testing. The CEO leaned back in his chair, watching carefully. He didn't interrupt much. He didn't need to. The silence after each failed attempt said enough. By mid-morning, the room felt different. Voices lowered. Egos clashed. Excuses began creeping in. "This kind of issue usually takes weeks. We need more data. The system is too complex." The CEO hated that word. Complex. To him, it usually meant, "I don't know." That's when Ozzy Osbourne arrived. No announcement. No dramatic entrance. No entourage. Most people didn't recognize him at first. A few glanced over, confused about why he was there. He didn't look like the others. No tailored suit, no flashy confidence, just calm, observant, almost relaxed. Simonin leaned over and whispered, "Who's that?" Another shrugged. "No idea." Ozzy didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't open a laptop or check his phone. He just watched, really watched, the way the experts argued, the way they fixated on certain numbers, the way they kept circling the same assumptions without questioning them. The CEO noticed him eventually, not because Ozzy demanded attention, but because he didn't. While everyone else tried to be the smartest person in the room, Ozzy seemed perfectly comfortable being the quietest. Hers passed. The problem remained unsolved. The CEO finally stood up, frustration written all over his face. "I brought in the best minds money can buy," he said sharply. "And you're telling me none of you can fix this?" No one answered. That's when Ozzy shifted slightly in his chair. Still calm, still quiet. He had seen enough. The setup was complete, even if no one in the room realized it yet. Because while 20 experts were busy proving how smart they were, one man had been quietly understanding the problem. And he was about to change everything. The problem wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. There were no explosions, no dramatic system-wide failures, no obvious error messages screaming for attention. Instead, the system failed quietly, randomly, without warning. One moment everything worked perfectly. The next, critical processes froze, data mismatched, and transactions stalled halfway through execution. For a billion-dollar company, that kind of failure was a nightmare. On the main screen, a dashboard glowed with red and yellow indicators. Each one represented a subsystem tied into a massive network: servers, databases, automated decision engines, and third-party integrations. Individually, they looked fine. Collectively, they behaved like something was deeply wrong. That's the frustrating part. One expert said, rubbing his eyes, "Nothing is technically broken." Another expert leaned forward. "We've tested every component. Under isolation, they all pass." "That's impossible," someone snapped. "If nothing's broken, it shouldn't fail." But it did again and again. Every crash cost money. Real money. Not projections, not hypotheticals. Losses were already climbing into the tens of millions. Clients were calling. Investors were circling. And the CEO knew one thing for sure. If this wasn't solved fast, heads would roll. The experts went deeper. They rewrote logic. They optimized processes. They increased redundancy. Each fix felt brilliant. For about 10 minutes. Then the system failed again. Silence followed every collapse. The whiteboard was now a battlefield of crossed-out ideas. Arrows pointed nowhere. Assumptions contradicted each other. One expert insisted the issue was scalability, another blamed latency. A third argued it was a rare edge case triggered by peak usage. All of them were partially right, and completely wrong. The real issue was buried under layers of confidence. Every expert had approached the problem the same way. They trusted the design. They assumed the foundation was solid. They assumed the architecture made sense. They assumed the problem had to be complex, because simple problems didn't survive this long. That assumption became their blind spot. The CEO paced slowly behind them, hands clasped behind his back. He watched as highly paid minds argued over decimals and diagrams. He listened to explanations that sounded intelligent but led nowhere. "How long to fix it?" he asked finally. No one answered immediately. "Well," he pressed. One expert cleared his throat. "If I'm being honest, we don't have a timeline." That was the worst possible answer. The CEO stopped pacing. His reflection stared back at him from the glass wall. He'd built this company by believing that every problem had a solution, if you asked the right questions. But right now, no one was asking new questions. They were all trying to win the problem instead of understand it. Meanwhile, Ozzy sat quietly. He wasn't focused on the flashing alerts or the scrolling code. His eyes moved differently. He watched how the experts reacted when something failed. He noticed which data points they ignored. He paid attention to the moments when everyone nodded in agreement, especially when that agreement wasn't earned. One screen kept catching his attention. Not the main dashboard, not the error logs. A small auxiliary panel in the corner. It showed a stream of data no one talked about because it seemed insignificant. Timestamps, synchronization markers, minor discrepancies that corrected themselves. Most of the time, Ozzy leaned forward slightly. Every failure happened after a correction. Not during load spikes, not during heavy usage, after the system tried to fix itself. That detail didn't fit the experts' theories. Because if the system was failing after stabilization, then the problem wasn't pressure. It was design. The experts continued debating. We should add another verification layer. That'll slow everything down. Better slow than broken. No, better correct than complicated. Ozzy exhaled softly. They were stacking solutions on top of a flawed assumption. The CEO finally spoke again, voice tight with frustration. We are running out of time. That's when Ozzy looked at the clock on the wall. 60 seconds, not because someone gave him a deadline, but because that's how long it would take to explain what everyone else had missed. The problem wasn't too complex. It was too obvious. And the more the experts tried to fix it, the more they proved they were looking in the wrong direction. Ozzy straightened in his chair. The moment to speak was coming. And once he did, the entire room would realize something uncomfortable. They hadn't failed because the problem was impossible. They had failed because they never questioned the one thing they all believed was untouchable. The foundation. Ozzy didn't announce himself. He didn't clear his throat or raise his hand like everyone else had been doing all morning. He didn't interrupt the argument unfolding at the center of the room. He simply stood up. The movement was small, but in a room full of exhausted minds, it was enough to shift attention. A few experts glanced over, irritated. Another sighed quietly, assuming this was about to be another half-baked theory added to the pile. The CEO noticed too, but said nothing. At this point, expectations were low. Ozzy walked toward the main screen. Not confidently, not nervously, just steadily, like someone who already knew where they were going. I might be wrong, he said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension without raising it. But can I ask one question? An expert near the table scoffed under his breath. We've asked every question possible. Ozzy nodded slightly. I believe you. That response caught a few people off guard. The CEO gestured with one hand. Make it quick. Ozzy didn't rush. He pointed to the auxiliary panel. The one no one had discussed all day. Why does this correction process run after synchronization instead of before? The room paused. Not silence. Confusion. One expert frowned. Because that's how it's designed. Another added quickly. It's industry standard. Ozzy smiled faintly. Standards are useful, he said, until they're not. A few people shifted in their seats. This was uncomfortable territory. No one liked being questioned about assumptions they hadn't consciously made. The CEO leaned forward slightly. Go on. Ozzy nodded and continued. You're all treating the failures as random, but they're not. They're consistent. Every crash happens right after the system believes it has stabilized. That doesn't make sense, an expert snapped. Stabilization reduces risk. Unless, Ozzy replied gently, the act of stabilizing is what introduces the risk. That landed heavier than expected. Someone laughed. Short, dismissive. So what? The system is sabotaging itself. In a way, Ozzy said. Yes. The laughter faded. Ozzy tapped the screen again. This correction layer was added later, wasn't it? An uncomfortable pause. Finally, one expert spoke. Yes. 2 years ago, after a minor inconsistency issue. And ever since then, Ozzy said, you've been fixing symptoms instead of the cause. He turned to face the room fully now. You built a system that doesn't trust its own data, he continued. So it keeps adjusting itself. Those micro adjustments stack up. Most of the time they cancel out, but under certain conditions they amplify. The CEO's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but focus. Say that again, he said. Ozzy didn't repeat himself, he simplified. You taught the system to panic quietly. No one spoke. One expert shook his head. If that were true, we would have seen it in testing. Ozzy nodded. You did. You just ignored it. Because the corrections usually worked. The room felt different now. Less defensive, more alert. Ozzy wasn't attacking anyone. He wasn't trying to prove he was smarter. He was explaining something as if it were obvious, almost inevitable. You don't need another layer, he said. You need to remove one. That suggestion hit like a slap. Remove a layer, undo years of work. Admit the foundation was flawed. The CEO stood up slowly. If you're right, he said carefully, then everything we've been doing today has made it worse. Ozzy met his gaze. That's usually how these problems work. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. An expert whispered, "How long would it take to test this?" Ozzy glanced at the screen. 60 seconds. That was when the room truly went silent, not because they believed him, but because, for the first time all day, someone's explanation actually made sense. And deep down, every expert in that room felt it. They hadn't been outsmarted. They had been out-assumed, and now, the underdog, the quiet man no one noticed, had just flipped the entire problem on its head. What happened next would decide everything. No one spoke as Ozzy stepped closer to the control console. This was the moment where confidence usually cracked, where bold theories collapsed under real testing. 20 experts watched him now, arms crossed, faces tight with doubt and curiosity fighting for control. The CEO stood just behind Ozzy, eyes locked on the screen, fully aware that this was either about to save millions or waste one last minute they didn't have. "Don't change anything yet," Ozzy said calmly. That alone was strange. Every attempt before this involved adding something, new rules, new checks, new safeguards. Ozzy was doing the opposite. He was asking to take something away. He pointed to the correction layer in the system architecture. "This module was designed to protect the system," he said, "but it assumes the data is wrong before it assumes the timing is." An expert leaned forward. "Because data integrity is more important than timing." Ozzy nodded. "In isolation, yes. But your system isn't isolated. It's alive. It reacts." He tapped a few keys. Not rewriting code, not redesigning anything. He simply disabled one automated correction trigger. Just one. "You're turning off a safety mechanism," someone said sharply. "For 60 seconds, Ozzy replied, long enough to see the truth. The CEO glanced at the clock. "Do it." A countdown timer appeared on the screen, 60:59. The system recalibrated. At first, nothing happened. That made people nervous. Normally, something always happened. Warnings, alerts, red flags. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm 50. An expert whispered, "This is where it usually crashes." But it didn't. The data stream stabilized. Minor discrepancies appeared, and for the first time the system didn't rush to correct them. They settled naturally, smoothing out instead of compounding. 40. Ozzy pointed to the metrics. "See that? No amplification." Summoning zoomed in on the graph. "The variance is shrinking." Another expert's voice was barely audible. "That's not possible." 30. The CEO stepped closer. His confident posture was gone. This was pure focus now. "What happens after a minute?" he asked. Ozzy didn't look away from the screen. "You'll know whether I'm right." 20. The room felt frozen in time. No one checked their phone, no one breathed too loudly. The experts, people who were used to being certain, were watching their certainty dissolve in real time. 10. The system hit the exact threshold that had caused every previous failure. Nothing broke. No crash, no freeze, no silent collapse. The timer hit 0. Silence. Then, a green status indicator appeared. "System stable," the monitor read. For a second, no one reacted. Then the room exploded. "That can't be right. Run it again. Increase the load. This has to be a coincidence." The CEO raised his hand. Again, they re-enabled the trigger. The system failed within seconds. They disabled it again. Stable again. Fail again. Stable. The pattern was undeniable. The CEO slowly turned to face the room. He solved it. No one argued. One expert sank back into his chair, staring at the ceiling. Another laughed softly, not in amusement but disbelief. All that effort, All that complexity, undone by removing a single assumption. The CEO looked at Azie now, not as an outsider, not as an interruption, but as the most valuable mind in the room. "You didn't need 60 seconds, he said quietly. Azie shrugged. "I just needed everyone to stop talking long enough for the system to explain itself." The weight of that sentence hit hard. This wasn't genius built on complexity. This was clarity, built on humility. The billionaire CEO smiled, something no one in that room had seen all day. And in that moment, every expert understood a painful truth. They hadn't been beaten by a smarter solution. They had been beaten by a simpler one. And the man they underestimated had just changed everything. The room didn't celebrate. There was no cheering. No sudden relief, filled laughter, no high fives like in movies. What replaced the tension was something heavier. Realization. The kind that settles slowly, uncomfortably, and stays. The billionaire CEO was the first to move. He didn't speak right away. He walked to the window, looked out over the city he helped build, and exhaled deeply. For a man who controlled thousands of employees and billions in assets, moments like this were rare. The moments when control gave way to clarity. Behind him, the experts sat in silence. Some stared at the screen, replaying the result over and over in their minds. Others looked down, embarrassed, not because they were wrong, but because the answer had been there the entire time. One expert quietly closed his laptop. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Azie remained standing where he was, calm, neutral, unchanged. The CEO finally turned around. "How did none of us see that?" he asked. Not accusing, not angry, genuinely curious. Azie thought for a moment. "Because you were all hired to be right," he said. "Not to be wrong first." That landed harder than any insult. The CEO nodded slowly. "You're saying our expertise worked against us?" "Yes," Azie replied. "Expertise is powerful, but it also builds habits. And habits stop us from questioning foundations." No one interrupted him now. One of the senior experts finally spoke. "So, what happens next?" Azie looked at the system status. Still stable. "Now you rebuild. Not the system, but the mindset. Document this. Teach your teams to challenge assumptions, not just optimize them." The CEO stepped closer. "And you?" he asked. "What do you want?" That question carried weight. Consulting contracts worth millions often started with that sentence. Azie smiled faintly. "Nothing I didn't already get." "And what's that?" "Proof," Azie said. "That listening still beats talking." The CEO let out a quiet laugh, half relief, half admiration. Then his tone shifted. "I brought in 20 experts," he said, turning to the room, "and I'm paying every one of you. Not because you failed, but because you stayed when it got uncomfortable." He paused, then added, "But today reminded me of something important." Everyone waited. Titles don't solve problems. Thinking does. The power in the room had shifted, not toward Azie alone, but away from ego. One by one, experts approached Azie. Not to argue, not to defend themselves, but to ask questions. Real ones, honest ones. How did he spot it? What should they look for next time? What signals did they miss? Azie answered without superiority, without performance. As if this outcome had been inevitable once the noise stopped. The CEO watched it all carefully. Then he made a decision. "We're changing how we solve problems here," he announced. "Fewer presentations. More observation. Less noise. More questions." He turned to Azie one last time. "You walked in here as the quietest person in the room." Azie nodded. "And you're walking out as the one who changed it." Azie picked up his jacket. No applause followed him. No cameras. No dramatic farewell. Just respect, the real kind. The kind that doesn't need volume to be felt. And as the door closed behind him, every person in that boardroom knew they'd just witnessed something rare. A reminder that true power doesn't announce itself, it proves itself. The system stayed stable long after Azie left the building. Then days, no crashes, no silent failures, no emergency meetings. What had once felt like an unsolvable crisis quietly disappeared. Not because it was fought harder, but because it was finally understood. Inside the company, the story spread fast. Not the technical details. Not the code changes, the lesson. People talked about the moment 20 experts fell silent. About the man who didn't compete for attention yet saw what everyone else missed. About how the loudest voices weren't the smartest ones, and how the simplest question changed everything. The CEO brought it up in meetings afterward. Not as a flex. Not as a warning. As a reminder, we don't reward noise here, he told his teams. We reward clarity. And slowly, the culture shifted. Engineers started asking why before asking how. Managers stopped mistaking confidence for competence. Meetings got shorter, but thinking got deeper. All because of one uncomfortable truth. Most failures aren't caused by lack of intelligence. They're caused by unchallenged assumptions. Ozzy never took credit for the solution. He didn't publish a case study or give interviews about it. To him, it wasn't a miracle. It was just what happens when you stop trying to look smart and start trying to see clearly. That's the part people forget. Genius isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always come with titles or credentials. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, waiting for everyone else to finish talking. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't shout. It points. This story isn't really about Ozzy Osbourne. It's about how often we ignore the obvious because it doesn't sound impressive enough. How we trust complexity more than clarity. How we listen to status instead of substance. And how that habit costs us time, money, and insight. So the next time you're stuck, when the experts are arguing, when solutions keep failing, when everything feels complicated beyond repair, ask yourself one simple question. What assumption am I afraid to question? Because the answer you're looking for might not be hidden. It might be right in front of you. Quiet, overlooked, and waiting. If this story made you think, type clarity in the comments. If you believe humility beats ego, type respect, and tell me. Have you ever seen a simple idea outperform a complex one? Because the world doesn't need louder minds, it needs clearer ones.